of the Best American Science and Nature Writing 2004. Next, he's joined by contributors Daniel Dennett, Atul Gawande, Mike O'Connor, Chet Ramo, and Max Tegmark. It's an hour 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Editing the Best American Science and Nature Writing was a good occasion to reflect on what I value in science writing, what makes a good science essay. And I think that I look for two qualities. One of them is explanation, the ability to give the reader the click of understanding, that aha that comes from seeing a complex phenomenon explained from more elementary principles. And the ideal that I had comes not from a work of science writing, but rather from an experience that I had as a graduate student. Not anything that I learned in graduate school, mind you, but the experience that one tends to have living in the kind of apartment that a graduate student can afford. So I had some leaky plumbing in my Somerville tenement, and the landlord called in a plumber who then offered an explanation as to what had gone wrong. And he said, I feared at the time that he might be an underemployed PhD in physics during a time of high anxiety about job prospects for PhDs. But nonetheless, I was very impressed by his explanation. He pointed out, first of all, that water, being matter, obeys Newton's second law, that water is dense, and that water is incompressible. So when you turn on your tap and then turn it off, you've got a big, heavy, incompressible mass that has to decelerate very quickly, kind of like a car slamming into a brick wall. And left to its own devices, that collision would tend to work away at the threads of the pipe, causing a leak. Time after time, you'd have this massive heap of substance going wham against the end of the pipe. So to deal with this problem, plumbers install a little gadget called a pipe riser, which is simply an empty pipe filled with air, sealed at the end, at right angles to the direction of the flow of the water. Then when you turn off the tap, the water compresses the air, which unlike water is compressible, which acts as a shock absorber so that the suddenly decelerating water doesn't loosen the pipe threads. However, Henry's law applies, for those of you who remember that from high school, namely that a gas under pressure will dissolve into a liquid, and over time the air in the pipe riser will gradually dissolve into the water. The pipe riser fills with water, rendering it useless. So every once in a while, a plumber has to bleed the pipes, let air into it so that it can refill the pipe riser, restoring its efficacy as a shock absorber. The landlord hadn't done that. That's why there was a loud water hammer. That's why the threads got loose. That's why there was a leak. Now, this isn't exactly the harmony of the spheres or the grandeur in this view of life, but it captures one of the two things that I value in science writing, and that is showing how a capricious phenomenon can be completely explained through the interaction of a few elementary laws. Now, of course, the second quality of a good science essay, as opposed to just a good lecture in a science class, is good writing. Clear, elegant, vigorous writing. And again, I have an ideal as to how that should be done, again from graduate school, and again not from the graduate school curriculum, but rather the late psychologist Gordon Allport, who was taught for many years at Harvard, had composed a mimeographed two-page document that he used to hand out to his graduate students on how to write a thesis. And he was long dead by the time I got to Harvard, but these guides had been passed down from generation to generation of graduate students. I still remember the purple mimeograph as before Xerox machines were affordable. And in it, he gave an example of his ideal of a well-crafted scientific prose, which came from a 10-year-old girl who, he said, deserved our admiration, if not for the accuracy of her facts, then at least for the clarity of her diction. And I'm going to read to you from that essay. It's called The Owl, by a 10-year-old girl. The bird that I'm going to write about is the owl. The owl cannot see at all by day, and at night is as blind as a bat. I do not know much about the owl, so I will go on to the beast I'm going to choose. It is the cow. The cow is a mammal. It has 6 sides: right, left, an upper, and below. At the back it has a tail on which hangs a brush. With this it sends the flies away so that they do not fall into the milk. The head is for the purpose of growing horns, and so that the mouth can be somewhere. The horns are to butt with, and the mouth is to moo with. Under the cow hangs the milk. It is arranged for milking. When people milk, the milk comes through, and there is never any end to the supply. How the cow does it, I have not yet realized, but it makes more and more. The cow has a fine sense of smell. One can smell it far away. This is the reason for the fresh air in the country. The man cow is called an ox. It is not a mammal. The cow does not eat much, but what it eats twice so that it gets enough. When it is hungry, it moos, and when it says nothing, it is because its inside is all full up with grass. And as Allport ended his essay, ladies and gentlemen, let that be your model. Well, we have this evening a number of models of both elegant explanation and clear, vigorous prose, and I'm going to introduce them to you in alphabetical order. The first of the contributors who could be here this evening is my friend and colleague Dan Dennett, who's the author of Freedom Evolves, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and many other books. He is university professor and Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy and director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. He was born in Boston in 1942, the son of a historian by the same name, and received his BA in philosophy from Harvard in 1963. He then went to Oxford to work with Gilbert Ryle, who, by the way, is the originator of the phrase, the ghost in the machine. It was only later that it was co-opted as the name of an album by the rock group The Police, but Dan's advisor, Gilbert Ryle, deserves that credit. He taught at UC Irvine from 1965 to 1971 when he moved to Tufts, where he has taught ever since. His first book, Content and Consciousness, appeared in 1969, followed by Brainstorms, Elbow Room, The Intentional Stance, Consciousness Explained, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Kinds of Minds, and Brain Children. In addition, he co-edited The Mind's Eye, capital I, with Douglas Hofstadter in 1981. I'd like to add that Dan, who's I'm sure is well known to many of you, occupies a special place in contemporary philosophy. I think more than any philosopher of the last half of the 20th century, he has both contributed to the subject matter of philosophy and made it accessible to a wide readership. Dan takes the toughest problems in philosophy, the nature of free will, the nature of consciousness, the mind-body problem, the nature of knowledge, and many others, and as well as developing his own original analysis of these problems, conveys it to people in a way that is filled with humor and insight, and though the content is difficult, any intelligent person willing to put in the effort can get something out of Dan Dennett's writings. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dan to read from his essay in the volume.
Thanks, Steve. It's an honor to be among the authors in the book that you edited, and among particularly the ones on the podium with me here. I've read all their stuff, and it's just it's great to be part of this group. My selection from the book is called The Mythical Threat of Genetic Determinism, and it appeared originally in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I'll just read a part of it. We have a very short time here. It is time to set minds at ease by raising the specter of genetic determinism and banishing it once and for all. According to the late Stephen Jay Gould, genetic determinists believe the following, quoting now, "If we are programmed to be what we are, then these traits are ineluctable. We may at best channel them, but we cannot change them either by will, education, or culture." If this is genetic determinism, then we can all breathe a sigh of relief. There are no genetic determinists. I have never encountered anybody who claims that will, education, and culture cannot change many, if not all, of our genetically inherited traits. My genetic tendency to myopia is canceled by the eyeglasses I wear. but I do have to want to wear them. Many of those who would otherwise suffer from one genetic disease or another can have the symptoms postponed indefinitely by being educated about the importance, say, of a particular diet, or by the culture-born gift of one prescription medicine or another. If you have the gene for the disease phenylketonuria, all you have to do to avoid its undesirable effects is stop eating food containing phenylalanine. What is inevitable doesn't depend on whether determinism reigns, but on whether or not there are steps we can take based on information we can get in time to take those steps to avoid the foreseen harm. There are two requirements for meaningful choice: information and a path for the information to guide. Without one, the other is useless or worse. In his excellent survey of contemporary genetics, Matt Ridley drives the point home with the poignant example of Huntington's disease, which he said in his book, he described it as pure fatalism, undiluted by environmental variability. Good living, good medicine, healthy food, loving families, or great riches can do nothing about it. This is in sharp contrast to all the equally undesirable genetic predispositions that we can do something about. And it is for just this reason that many people who are likely, given their family tree, to have the Huntington's mutation choose not to take the simple test that would tell them with virtual certainty whether they have it. But note that if and when a path opens up, as it may in the future, for treatment, for treating those who have Huntington's mutation, these same people will be first in line to take the test. And since I've written that, exactly this has happened. Beverly Davidson at the University of Iowa has found a way of addressing the Huntington protein gene, and so the very example that Ridley gave as an example of what is currently genetically inevitable is going to be a thing of the past in the near future. Steve, back to the text here. Gould and others have declared their firm opposition to genetic determinism. But I doubt if anybody thinks our genetic endowments are infinitely revisable. It is all but impossible that I will ever give birth thanks to my Y chromosome. I cannot change this by either will, education, or culture. At least not in my lifetime. But who knows what another century of science will make possible. So at least for the foreseeable future, some of my genes fix some parts of my destiny without any real prospects of exemption. If that is genetic determinism, we're all genetic determinists, Gould included. Once the caricatures are set aside, what remains at best are honest differences of opinion about just how much intervention it would take to counteract one genetic tendency or another, and more important, whether such intervention would be justified. Consider the affliction known as not knowing a word of Chinese. I suffer from it, thanks entirely to environmental influences early in my childhood. My genes had nothing directly to do with it. If I were to move to China, however, I could soon enough be cured with some effort on my part, though I would no doubt bear deep and unalterable signs of my deprivation, readily detectable by any native Chinese speaker for the rest of my life. But I could certainly get good enough in Chinese to be held responsible for actions I might take under the influence of Chinese speakers that I encountered. Isn't it true that whatever isn't determined by our genes must be determined by our environment? What else is there? There's nature and there's nurture. Is there also some X, some further contributor to what we are? There's chance, luck. This extra ingredient is important, but doesn't have to come from the quantum bowels of our atoms or from some distant star. It's all around us in the causeless coin flipping of our noisy world, automatically filling in the gaps of specification left unfixed by our genes and unfixed by salient causes in our environment. This is particularly evident in the way the trillions of connections between cells in our brains are formed. It has been recognized for years that the human genome, large as it is much too small to specify in its gene recipes all the connections that are formed between neurons. What happens is that the genes specify processes that set in motion huge population growth of neurons. Many times more neurons than our brains will eventually use. And these neurons send out exploratory branches at random, or pseudo-random, of course. And many of these happen to connect to other neurons in ways that are detectably useful, detectable by the mindless processes of brain pruning. These winning connections tend to survive, while the losing connections die, to be dismantled so that their parts can be recycled for the next generation of hopeful neuron growth a few days later. This selective environment within the brain, especially within the brain of the fetus, long before it encounters the outside environment, no more specifies the final connections than the genes do. Saliencies in both genes and developmental environment influence and prune the growth, but there's plenty that's just left to chance. When the human genome was recently published, and it was announced that we have only about 30,000 genes, by today's assumption about how to identify and count genes, not the 100,000 genes that some experts had surmised, there was an amusing sigh of relief in the press. Whew! We're not just the products of our genes, we get to contribute all the specifications that those 70,000 genes would otherwise have fixed in us. And how, one might ask, are we to do this? Aren't we under just as much of a threat of the dread environment, nasty old nurture, with its insidious indoctrination techniques? When nature and nurture have done their work, will there be anything left over to be me? Does it matter what the trade-off is if, one way or another, our genes and our environment, including chance, divide up the spoils and fix our characters? Perhaps it seems that the environment is a more benign source of determination, since, after all, we can change the environment. That's true, but we can't change a person's past environment any more than we can change her parents. And environmental adjustments in the future can be just as vigorously addressed to undoing prior genetic constraints as prior environmental constraints. And we're now on the verge of being able to adjust the genetic future almost as readily as the environmental future. Suppose you know that any child of yours will have a problem that can be alleviated by either an adjustment to its genes or an adjustment to its environment. There can be many valid reasons for favoring one treatment policy over another, but it is certainly not obvious that one of these options should be ruled out on moral or metaphysical grounds. Suppose, to make up an imaginary case that will probably soon be outrun by reality, suppose you are a committed Inuit who believes that life above the Arctic Circle is the only life worth living. And suppose you are told that your children will be genetically ill-equipped for living in such an environment. You can move to the tropics, where they will be fine, at the cost of giving up their environmental heritage. Or you can adjust their genomes, permitting them to continue living in the Arctic world at the cost, if it is one, of the loss of some of their natural genetic heritage. The issue is not about determinism, either genetic or environmental, or both together. The issue is about what we can change, whether or not our world is deterministic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan Dennett. Atul Gawande is a general and endocrine surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. He is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health. He has also been a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine since 1998. His first book, Complications, A Surgeon's Notes on an Imperfect Science, was published in 2002 and was a National Book Award finalist for nonfiction. He is, in theory, working on a book about experimentation in medicine. And those of you who have read Atul's essays in the New Yorker, I'm sure will agree with me that they are, each one of them is a little gem of honest, elegant, and fascinating reporting, both on the science of medicine, such as it is, and on the experience of practicing it with all of the constraints and imperfections that come about because it is a human science. Now we'll hear Atul Gawande reading from his essay in Best American Science.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be here, especially amongst these writers whom I've read for far longer than I've written and admire so much. Part of me has to wonder about why I might be here in the first place. A surgeon is the furthest from a scientist for many people, perhaps a craftsman or perhaps a plumber or a carpenter would be a closer approximation. But there are scientists among us in surgery. One of the greatest was Franny Moore, a surgeon at my hospital, the former chairman of surgery. He had, among other things, led the team that succeeded in doing the first kidney transplant operation, the first transplant surgery of any kind. And when they did so, it was what it took that fascinated me. They had 30 deaths before they had their first success. After 10, people in the medical community asked, is it right to be continuing the experiments that they were doing? After 20, there were people revolting even within the hospital. Residents who would never have questioned authority at this level in the 1950s actually refused to take care of the patients who were being operated on, calling it murder. And then after 30, they succeeded. And the team won the Nobel Prize for that work. Franny Moore was on the cover of Time magazine. What I wondered about is what it took to be the sort of person who could push ahead with your experiments, to be arrogant enough to believe that you could succeed where all the evidence in front of you showed you were failing. And the story of Franny Moore then began with, of all things, a fire. And so I'll start from there in this piece which had appeared in the New Yorker. On November 28, 1942, an errant match set alight the paper fronds of a fake electric-lit palm tree in a corner of the Coconut Grove nightclub near Boston's Theater District and started one of the worst fires in American history. The flames caught onto the fabric decorating the ceiling and then swept everywhere, engulfing the place within minutes. The club was jammed with almost 1,000 revelers that night. Its few exit doors were either locked or blocked, and hundreds of people were trapped inside. Rescue workers had to break through the walls to get to them. Those with any signs of life were sent primarily to two hospitals, Massachusetts General Hospital and Boston City Hospital. At Boston City Hospital, doctors and nurses gave the patients the standard treatment for their burns. At MGH, however, an iconoclastic surgeon named Oliver Cope decided to try an experiment on the victims. Francis Daniels Moore, then a fourth-year surgical resident, was one of only two doctors working on the emergency ward when the victims came in. The experience and the experiment changed him. And because they did, modern medicine would never be the same. It had been a slow night, and Moore, who was 29 years old, was up in his call room listening to a football game on the radio. At around 10:30 p.m., he heard the familiar whine of an ambulance arriving outside, put on his white coat, and went to see what was going on. Making his way to the ward, he heard another ambulance arriving, then another, and another, and another. He broke into a run. In less than 2 hours, he received 114 burn victims. He described the scene several days later in a letter to his parents. Down the hall were streaming stretchers with burned people on them. One, a young girl with her clothing burned off and her skin hanging like ribbons as she flailed her arms around, screaming with pain. Another, a naval lieutenant who kept repeating over and over again, "I must find her, I must find her." His face and hands were the dead paper white that only a deep third-degree burn can be, and I knew, only looking at him for a moment, that if he lived, in 2 weeks, his face would be a red, unrecognizable slough. He didn't live. Moore grabbed a syringe full of morphine and gave anyone he found alive a slug for the pain. Dozens died in those first few hours. Many succumbed from shock and overwhelming injuries. Others, some without a single burn on them, died of asphyxia, their singed throats slowly swelling closed. In all, nearly 500 people died from the fire. Of MGH's 114 patients, only 39 survived long enough to be admitted to the hospital and treated for their burns. Bodies were laid in rows along a corridor. A hospital floor was cleared for the survivors. And at Oliver Cope's insistence, the experiment began. The conventional treatment for severe burns was to tan the burn surface as quickly as possible, and at Boston City, that is what the surgeons did. People who initially survive bad burns remain at high risk of dying from infection in the days to follow. Your skin protects you from the germs of the outside world. A burn opens the portals. Applying tannic acid to a burn was a way to create a thickened protective cover. Patients were given morphine and soaked in a bathtub. Then their blisters were cut off, and the acid slowly poured on their wounds. The process was extraordinarily painful and laborious, and sometimes fatal. It also took 4 or 5 trained personnel to care for one patient. Still, it was approved therapy, and it had been standard practice for years. Medicine, especially surgery, is a conservative profession. A physician departs only reluctantly from the established techniques and lessons, and for good reason. The stakes, if you are wrong, are too high. Doctors are expected to adopt new treatments only with strong evidence that they will have better results. But Cope was a believer, and one of the things he believed was that tannic acid treatment was no good. Earlier that year, he'd been called on for advice following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Investigators had found that the major casualties were not from blast injuries, but from burns from the fires that followed. Medical personnel had been overwhelmed by the labor required by tannic acid treatments. A day and a half after the attack, they still had not completed the initial care for victims. Many patients died waiting. Cope proposed wrapping people's burns in gauze coated with petroleum jelly and then leaving them alone. The treatment would be far less painful, and a single doctor could care for 4 or 5 patients by himself. To many, the notion that a thin layer of gauze smeared with Vaseline would stop infection seemed foolish. Yet on the night of the Coconut Grove fire, despite numerous lives at stake, intense media attention, criticism from the surgical establishment, and the fact that MGH's results could be compared very easily with Boston City's, Cope insisted on his experimental treatment. He had tried it just twice, once on himself. But he had found in the laboratory that blisters protected by petroleum jelly gauze appeared to stay sterile. Francis Moore was intelligent and ambitious. He was also, before the fire, still relatively unformed. He had received his undergraduate and medical degrees at Harvard, but had distinguished himself more as a wit than as a scholar. Chronic asthma from childhood had kept him out of the war. He was no better skilled in the operating room than his fellow residents. But the Coconut Grove disaster became his Omaha beach. It exposed him to a magnitude of suffering he scarcely imagined possible, leaving him with a thick, protective hide of his own. And it gave him his first true expertise. He saw more serious burns from this one catastrophe than most surgeons do in their careers, and he came to publish dozens of papers in the field. Despite the range of his eventual influence, he called himself a burn surgeon the rest of his life. Moore, or Franny as everyone called him, went on to become one of the most important surgeons of the 20th century. He discovered the chemical composition of the human body and was a pioneer in the development of nuclear medicine. As the youngest chairman of surgery in Harvard's history, he led his department to attempt some of the most daring medical experiments ever conducted. Experiments that established, among other things, organ transplantation, heart valve surgery, and the use of hormonal therapy against breast cancer. Along the way, the line between patients and experimental subjects was blurred. His attempts to develop new procedures inevitably cost lives, as well as save them. His advances made medicine more radical, more invasive of human bodies, and more dependent upon technology. But in November of 1942, he got his first sense of what might be possible when you put aside and convention. In the hours and days after the fire, Moore carried out Cope's experimental treatment. A month later, investigators from the National Research Council arrived in Boston. At Boston City Hospital, the council's final report said some 30% of the initial survivors had died, most from infections and other complications of their burns. At MGH, none of the initial survivors had died from their burn wounds. cautious, experience lost. And as Moore would always remember, experiment won. Thank you.
Great. That was Atul Gawande. Mike O'Connor graduated in 1975 from Westfield State College with certification in teaching, but ended up taking a job as director of a Cape Cod youth center. After 5 years, Mike left the lucrative $8,000 per year youth center job and took a job delivering coal. Really. It was while driving around Cape Cod in the coal truck that he realized that other people besides himself were putting out bird feeders. In the spring of '83, he tearfully left his coal job and opened the Birdwatchers General Store in Orleans. As far as he knew, it was the first birding store ever, and most bankers and real estate people agreed, as they were reluctant to take his idea seriously. Yet nearly 22 years later, the Birdwatchers General Store is still selling birdseed, while thousands of other birdwatching specialty shops have opened up around the country. In the year 2000, the local newspaper, the Cape Codder, asked Mike to write a weekly Q&A column about birds called Ask the Bird Folks. Recently, Community Newspapers has inserted the Ask the Bird Folks column in all of their other weekly Cape Cod papers. I have been going to Cape Cod during the summer and many weekends for years, and I buy the Cape Codder just so that I can read Ask the Bird Folks. Way before I had any interest in birds. It is, I think, among the wittiest, best informed, and most enjoyable nature writing that I've seen in many years, and I was very eager to get the chance to meet Mike. So on one weekend this past summer, my 12-year-old nephew, an avid bird watcher, this boy knows more species than John James Audubon, spent the weekend with me, and we were going to make a pilgrimage to the Birdwatchers General Store. Eric, my nephew, found on one of the Cape beaches an egg which he identified as the egg of a piping plover, which those of you who frequent Cape Cod know is a threatened species, one for which considerable effort is expended to preserve them. And we took it to the Cape Cod General Store to ask Mike what should be done with it. And Mike looked at it and he said, "Make an omelet, it's not going to hatch." So this, I think, captures the irreverence and wit of Ask the Bird Folks. It contrasts, I think, very pleasantly with typical nature writing, aptly satirized by Mark Twain in his quote, "Far in the empty sky, a solitary esophagus slept upon motionless wing." That's what a lot of nature writing sounds like to me, but Mike O'Connor's nature writing is something different, and this evening he's going to tell us a bit about it.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you. And I have to admit, I'm a bit embarrassed and extremely flattered to be on the stage with these gentlemen. Yeah, I got an email from Steve last spring asking me if I wanted to be included in this. And I said, "Oh, yeah, sure, of course." I had no idea what it was. And I thought, "Oh, well, this will be fine." And then the book came out this fall, and I could feel the blood rush out of my head when I read the people that were in here and the credentials. And I'm so glad that there's doctors on the stage, because I could just pass out at any second right now. It's true that since '83 we've been running the Birdwatchers General Store on the Cape, and even though some of these people that I'm up here with are daily asked questions that deal with life and death, it really doesn't compare to the agony I have to go through trying to tell people how to keep squirrels away from their feeders. Seems to be one of the most important questions that is on everybody's mind that I deal with on a daily basis. Back in the year 2000, there was in the Cape Codder, which is a weekly newspaper on the Lower Cape, they carried a kind of a birding column that I didn't think was very good. And one day, one of the people from the newspaper came in, and I said, "You know, you have so many talented people. There's Mass Audubon has a property, the Museum of Natural History, the Cape Cod National Seashore has these top flight naturalist, I think you can do better. This woman really wasn't doing a very good job. You might want to consider one of them. So 3 days later, they came in and asked me to write it. That's what I get. So what I basically did was, took the endless questions about birds and things that people had and, answered their questions, but put them into the newspaper once a week. I guess I'm taking the credit now, but the staff, we have a talented artist that does all the illustrations for the column, and the staff proofreads things and tell me how many mistakes I've made, and we go over and over. And we seem to have gotten away, and somehow I'm in this book, and I don't really understand why, but I'll take it. So on the way up on the train, we took the train, my friend Jeff and I took the train from Kingston up here, and I'm thinking, I don't really know what's going to happen. Do we sign books? I really don't know what's going to happen. And Jeff said, well, they might ask you to read. Ooh, I'm not a very good reader. So we said, well, why don't you practice? So the train wasn't very crowded. They only had one car open, and there was like a dozen people. There was us, 10 other people, and a screaming baby. So we went down to the end where the other people were. They're trying to avoid the baby. And I practiced reading one of the columns. I practiced it over and over, and by the time I looked up, everybody had moved back with a screaming baby. And then I got here, and I see cameras, and I see these gentlemen in ties, and I feel like, okay, I am so out of place here. So what I will do is, if I get through this somehow, is read one of the columns that I've written based on a question from some guy named Toby from Wellfleet. Last year, exactly at this time, the Cape is kind of a place where unusual birds show up, just like Mount Auburn Cemetery is over here, or Cape Ann. And last year we had scissor-tailed flycatcher. Now, scissor-tailed flycatcher is a fairly ordinary-looking flycatcher, a simple-looking bird, but it has these beautiful long streamers coming out of its tail, and it really doesn't look at all like it belongs here. So it was kind of a big deal, and people would ask, and we'd go up and see it and stuff. But evidently, this person, Toby, from Wellfleet, kind of missed all the excitement and was walking the beach one day and saw all the goings-on, and he decided to write to me about it, or write to us about it. He wrote, Dear bird folks, last week while I was walking my dog, Mitzi, I was taking my dog Mitzi for a walk on Marconi Beach in Wellfleet, I came upon a group of nerdy bird watchers. They were all standing in the middle of the parking lot staring at what appeared to be a mockingbird. I was told that the bird was a scissor-tailed flycatcher. I didn't have any binoculars with me, but the bird didn't seem to be anything special. What was all the excitement about? Toby from Wellfleet. Hold on, Toby. You were spending the day at the beach with Mitzi the pug dog, who I'm sure was wearing a sweater, and you were calling a group of highly informed bird watchers nerdy? Let me tell you something about my fellow bird watchers. They are by far the most respectable... Wait, I know the group you're talking about. You're right, they are kind of nerdy. Forget what I said, and no offense to Mitzi or her sweater. It's too bad you didn't have binoculars with you, because scissor-tailed flycatchers are really great-looking birds. I'd be the first to admit that many birds are dull and difficult to identify. Some birds are so similar that they are impossible to figure out. Like trying to tell the difference between a pug dog and a squash loaf of bread. But there are plenty of birds like puffins, roadrunners, that will even catch the eye of non-birdie people. The scissor-tailed flycatcher is one of those exciting eye-catching birds. With its pink-colored sides and elegant 9-inch long tail, the scissor-tailed flycatcher is a striking bird. Mostly found in Texas, Oklahoma, and whatever that state is above Oklahoma. The scissor-tailed flycatchers are indeed a rare bird in these parts. They are more at home flying across the open western grasslands than on the dunes of Cape Cod. What makes this bird so fun to watch is that it is highly active and it sits out in the open for all to see. Perched on exposed branches or posts, the scissor-tailed flycatcher watches with keen eyes, looking for the slightest movement. Once it spots an insect, it zaps out, flashing its rose-colored sides and opening and closing its showy long tail, just like a pair of scissors. Beetles, grasshoppers, bees, wasps appear to be the bird's favorite food. That's right, these birds actually eat bees and wasps and seem to enjoy them. That should really freak out those people who worry about birds eating rice at weddings. After the breeding season, the scissor-tailed flycatchers form massive communal roosts in which many hundreds of these splendid birds seem to roost in a single tree. In the morning, the entire flock heads off in different directions, creating what must be a spectacular sight. Seeing a sight like that would almost make it worth moving to Texas. I said almost. After the breeding season, the flycatchers go to Florida, but most of them head to Central America, where they have cleaner elections. What this lone bird is doing far from its normal range is anybody's guess. It could have been pushed up by a storm, or its migration instincts could have somehow failed, or perhaps it won $5 million in the lottery and used it as down payment on a one-bedroom cottage in South Wellfleet. Whatever the reason, scissor-tailed flycatchers do have the habit of showing up in Cape Cod every few years. It's now the first week in December, and the bird you saw has been in the same spot, the parking lot at Marconi Beach, for nearly 3 weeks. I have no idea how long the bird will stay there, and if it will finally get a clue and head south, or even if it will survive. But if I were you, I would grab yourself some binoculars and go out and take a look at this flashy bird while you still can. Scissor-tailed flycatchers are warm-weather birds, and they really aren't made to handle our Cape Cod climate. However, it's not up to us to interfere. But if seeing it out there in the cold concerns you, Toby, you can always let it borrow one of Mitzi's sweaters. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike O'Connor. Chet Ramo recently retired as professor of physics and astronomy at Stonehill College in Massachusetts, where in May 1989 he received the college's first award for teaching excellence. For 40 years he has been a teacher and writer exploring relationships between science, nature, and the humanities. He is the author of a dozen books on science and nature for a general audience and 4 novels, and won a 1998 Lannan Literary Award for his nonfiction work. Ramo wrote a weekly science nature column for the Boston Globe between 1983 and 2003. His science musings can now be found on the web at www.ramo.com. The late Stephen Jay Gould once distinguished 2 styles of science writing, which he called Galilean and Franciscan. Galilean writing was how Steve Gould characterized his own essays, namely concerned with abstract principles, argumentative, expository, analytical. And he contrasted it with Franciscan writing, named after St. Francis, which was more of a aesthetic, appreciative of nature, lyrical in its writing style. Like Steve Gould, I tend to favor Galilean writing over Franciscan writing when it comes to science essays. But the columns of Chet Ramo, I think, combine both styles in a way that made me an addict of the science section of the Boston Globe for the 20 years in which he wrote them. The essays are both poetic and lyrical and make interesting analytical observations. And I, like many people, greatly miss seeing his column every Tuesday in the Boston Globe. Chet Ramo.
Well, the bases are loaded now, and I suppose I'm supposed to hit a home run. But at least I've got a recent arrival here to back up for me. Stephen, thanks, first of all, for the honor of including me in the anthology. This is one of 1,000 essays that I wrote for the Boston Globe over those 20 years, which have now come to an end. Indeed, I have written about at least 3 or 4 people on this podium in my columns. These are the people who give me something to write about. This is the one that Stephen picked out of the 50 for last year. How'd you do that? When I was in high school, many long years ago, the sciences were the basics: physics, chemistry, biology. Boys took physics and went on to become engineers and automobile mechanics. Girls took biology and became nurses and homemakers. And nobody took chemistry if they could help it, except a few nerds who wanted to make stink bombs. These days, the sciences are rather more jumbled up, and students might encounter physical chemistry, biophysics, biochemistry, or any of many other blended specialties. Gender in the classrooms is rather more jumbled now, too. But, by and large, the old categories stand. If you are going to organize science under a few practical headings, physics, chemistry, and biology are the best way to do it. These categories are not arbitrary. In broad outline, they correspond to how the universe evolves in space and time. The universe began as pure physics, in an explosion from an infinitely hot seed of radiant energy. During the first trillionth of a second, matter and antimatter flickered in and out of existence. The fate of the universe hung precariously in the balance. It might grow, or it might collapse back into nothingness. Suddenly, it ballooned to enormous size in what cosmologists call the inflationary epoch, bringing the first particles of matter, the quarks, into existence. Within a millionth of a second, the rapid swelling ceased, and the quarks began to combine into protons and neutrons. The universe continued to expand and cool, but now at a more stately pace. Within a few more minutes, protons and neutrons combined to form the first atomic nuclei, hydrogen and helium. But the universe was still too hot for the nuclei to attract electrons and make atoms. Not until 300,000 years after the beginning did the first atoms appear. In all of this, there was nothing of relevance to a chemist or a biologist. Chemistry could only begin when parts of the universe had cooled sufficiently for atoms to cling together as molecules, but not so cold that everything is locked together in rock-hard solids. And biology could only begin when the right kind of atoms, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, had appeared on the scene. The atoms of life were cooked up in stars by nuclear fusion and blasted into space when the stars died as supernovas. So even after the era of chemistry had begun, there was not yet the right elements for biological molecules. Billions of years had to pass, and generations of stars had to come and go before life became a possibility. Chemistry and biology require a flow of energy from the fabulously hot interiors of stars to the unimaginable cold of the intergalactic space. Only in tiny enclaves, precisely placed in this flow, is biology possible. The Earth is one such enclave. Physicists have all the universe to play with. chemists are basically confined to the galactic neighborhoods of stars. The realm of biologists is those slivers of space, just so far from a star, but not too far, where molecules such as water can exist as liquids somewhere between steam and ice. If, as most cosmologists now believe, the universe will expand forever, then the sciences will leave the stage in the reverse order in which they made their appearance. As the universe is stretched increasingly thin, the stars will eventually cease to shine and the flow of energy will stop. Life will be extinguished first, then chemical activity. Physics is indifferent to the temperature of the universe. The infinite temperature of the first instant or the absolute zero of the end, it's all part of the territory. High school science might be a lot more fun if it were taught in the context of the universe's story. The creation myths of our ancestors began with biology. A human-like divinity says, "Let there be light." And they end with biology too. The lights go out with human history. The modern universe story starts and ends with physics, with biology confined somewhere to the middle, and with even chemistry, boring old chemistry, getting its star turn on the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Chet Ramo. We have the arrival of one more contributor to Best American Science and Nature Writing 2004. And Amanda, I think we've been doing pretty well in keeping the readings concise. Do we have any time for our last contributor to read a paragraph or two? Okay, very good. Max Tegmark, in this particular universe, is an associate professor of physics at MIT and the University of Pennsylvania, and you will soon learn why it is relevant that that qualifier in this particular universe is part of his biography. Is that still true at MIT and University of Pennsylvania?
In this universe, yes.
Okay. After growing up in the Viking capital Stockholm and abandoning his parents and his brother to do a PhD in Berkeley and a postdoc at Munich, he studied cosmology, and currently he measures the properties of the universe using tools such as the cosmic microwave background and galaxy clustering. And for those of you who will be reading the essays in Best American Science and Nature Writing, certainly the contribution by Max Tegmark is, you will find, probably the most mind-expanding musing on the current state of physics that you're ever likely to read. This was, I think, a masterful blend of the most abstruse physics explained very lucidly with equally lucid comments on the philosophy of science as it applies to the mind-bending notion of parallel universes. And I hope Max Tegmark will enlighten us about that for a few minutes.
Thank you for this unexpected honor. I think since in some parallel universe I get to do a full reading anyway, rather than read to you from a random fragment of this, you can read much better at your own pace afterwards if you get the book. I would prefer to, I'm going to just make a few philosophical remarks which connect to what I wrote and follow naturally on what you heard from Chet Ramo here. Because especially being in a church and all, it's sort of inevitable to feel very small and insignificant hearing what you said and thinking about us being just a little blip and something even larger, maybe a level 1 parallel universe with an infinite space and infinitely many planets and stars, which is in turn maybe just one, and one of these level 2 multiverses I talk about from inflation, which is yet another little part of a still bigger quantum multiverse and so on, it's very easy to ask, what's the point of the whole thing? Is what I do here, is what you do here just completely irrelevant? Aren't we so small that we should all go home depressed? So let me just share with you my own personal emotional view on this, which has actually changed quite a bit over the years. And right now, I'm actually feeling quite strongly that I don't think we're quite as small and insignificant as I thought when I was a little bit younger. Let me share with you why. So when we look out there in space, there are two possibilities. Either what we normally call our universe, which is simply the spherical region of space that we can see, the sphere of diameter about 13 billion light years, from which light has actually had time to come to us, right? The region we can see, either that's teeming with life, there are other alien civilizations that for some reason we haven't found yet or heard of, either that, or this is it, we're alone. The only honest thing to say, I think, is at this point we don't know. And frankly, it may well be that life requires that evolution requires some pretty serious coincidences, and that we perhaps are the only life in the whole glorious universe that we can see out there. And that really puts a very different spin on everything we talked about here, because if you look at all this beautiful stuff out there and imagine that we humans were not here on this planet, as far as I'm concerned, it would all just be one grand waste of space with no one there to behold it. And it is in that case we humans, really, we self-aware organisms here, that give meaning to all of this. It's only in our eyes that it's beautiful and meaningful. And that makes us feel very significant. So even though we may be small, what I'm saying here is size isn't everything. And we're small not just in space. We humans are small and fragile also in time. The universe has been here for 13.7 billion years or so, give or take a few. And we humans have only been walking this earth for about 100,000 years, which is a very short time. And we laugh at the dinosaurs for being sort of a loser species and going extinct, but they lasted a lot longer than we have so far, right? So this is also a very special time that we're living in. And to make you feel even more significant about yourselves, think about this. It may be in your lifetime that it gets decided whether we're just going to nuke ourselves off this planet and make everything we can see a waste of space, or get our act together and help life grow into something much richer and much more exciting than we've ever been able to dream of. So on that optimistic note, thank you very much for inviting me here.
Thank you, Max Tegmark. Now I understand we have time for a few questions, and there is a microphone set up at the front. I would ask those of you who have questions to come and direct them to the appropriate panelist from the microphone here at the front of the church. Yes? Yeah.
The question is for you, Dr. Pinker. I was just wondering if you had a response to the article in today's Globe about the effort of various creationist groups to teach creationism in the public schools, to change the curriculum. And in fact, it's probably a question I could address to all of you, whether you are part of any joint effort by other scientists to try to do something to perhaps to combat the rising tide of what I feel is anti-intellectualism politically and throughout the world, in this country especially.
Yes, the question was about, referred to a story in the newspaper this morning about a development that has been growing over the last few years, which is to try to reintroduce creationist themes into biology education in many parts of the United States, often under the rubric of so-called intelligent design, in contrast to, sorry, it's not on, oh, okay. There you go. Okay. The question was about the recent political attempts to reintroduce creationism into biology education in American schools, often under the guise of the so-called intelligent design movement, which, unlike young Earth creationism, namely biblical literalism, the claim that the Earth really came into existence 5,000 years ago with Adam and Eve and 6 days of creation and so on, intelligent design is a more subtle attempt to reintroduce creationism into the schools by saying that life is too complex at the molecular and other levels to have arisen by chance, as they put it, misleadingly, because Darwinian natural selection is anything but random. And therefore, the complexity of life speaks to the existence of some cosmic engineer. In the intelligent design movement, the engineer is not specified, but I think everyone understands the subtext to be that that is God. Have I been involved in any efforts to address this? I'm glad that you asked, because I am one of the charter members of Project Steve. Now, Project Steve is the brainchild of Eugenie Scott, the director of the National Center for Science Education, which attempts to fight back at religiously motivated efforts to twist the biology curriculum in American education. And it was a response in particular to a series of paid ads in a number of newspapers in which a creationist think tank, the Discovery Institute, would round up somewhere in the country 20 scientists who would publicly express doubts about the validity of Darwin's theory of natural selection. And she said, "You have 20 scientists who doubt evolution? Well, we have 200 scientists who support evolution, all named Steve." This was in part a memorial to Stephen Jay Gould, who fought the encroachment of creationism in the 1980s. And it was an encouragement of scientists named Steve, Stefan, Stefano, Etienne, Stephanie, Steffi, and so on, to sign on. The Steveometer now is well over 400. Proportion of Steves in the population, one can estimate the degree of support of evolution among scientists. Needless to say, is overwhelming. I think this is significant, and it's easy for science to be put on the defensive by the accusation that some dogma is being propagated, that typically the attempts to reintroduce creationism take the form of saying, not saying that evolution is false or that intelligent design or other variants of creationism are true, but rather to frame it as a free speech issue. Teach the controversy, that both sides should be presented. Students should know that this is supposedly an active area of debate, which is in principle a reasonable idea as long as the alternatives all are considered by virtue of some kind of scientific coherence or evidence, which is most definitely not the case for intelligent design creationism, where if it wasn't for a religious motivation, then we would never have heard of it. So it is not just a case of competing scientific theories battling it out, but really one of them motivated by considerations that have nothing to do with science. And that I think is an important distinction, because indeed no one wants to suppress minority theories or unpopular theories if they have some claim to ordinary standards of scientific defensibility. Yes.
Yeah, my question is to any one of 3 or 4 of you on the panel who might feel, interested in following up on it. And this is sort of a segue from the other question, which is that my understanding of evolutionary psychology is such that in the last couple of decades or so, it's been more or less determined that a lot of the neuronal self-arrangements basically operate on an evolutionary basis. Those that work are essentially maintained, whereas organisms that have others that don't work have sort of vanished, and so we don't have Neanderthals wandering around. And basically, I was wondering if one of the modules, or if one wants to think in terms of the many types of modules that exist in the mind or the brain that enable the organism to to function and to genetically prosper, is one that actually it sets up the idea of some sort of a belief in either a deity or an overarching type of principle, and whether in fact this may, in fact, from an evolutionary point of view, be something that supports the organism. In other words, I understand that our genes at present really represent who we were 50,000 years ago, because things have been changing very rapidly. But whether, in fact, that type of a belief system helps people to survive disease or get together and group better from a social point of view and things like that. Do people believe that there are modules, or there is a module like that in the brain that sort of leads in that direction?
There have indeed been such proposals. There was a book called The God Gene, recently the subject of a cover story in Time magazine by Dean Hamer, and a claim about a God module by the eminent perceptual psychologist V.S. Ramachandran. It's not clear whether this was intended tongue-in-cheek or not. I myself am skeptical that a particular part of the brain was shaped by natural selection to foster religious belief, just because the fitness disadvantages would seem to me to be much more striking than any fitness advantage. If there was an advantage to group solidarity, for example, that would lead to the evolution of the appropriate emotions to foster group solidarity, such as loyalty, concern with reputation, desire to aid one's comrades, and so on. Why there would be a belief in a supernatural deity, in miracles, in prognosticating the future from arbitrary signs and so on is much less clear. My own hunch is that it's more likely to be a byproduct of other parts of the mind that were selected for their benefits. In particular, our ability to impute minds to other people, what Dan Dennett has called the intentional stance, the ability, once you have a species that explains other people's behavior by alluding to minds that they have that you can't witness directly, you can't read someone else's mind immediately, but you can guess that they have one, well, it's a short step to then positing minds that don't happen to be linked to bodies, that are in objects where we call them idols, or in natural things where we call it animism, or free-floating in which we call them souls and spirits. Likewise, there may be a part of the mind that attributes design to complex entities in the world. Again, I'll appeal to Dan, who calls this the design stance. It's a mental attitude that we are equipped with that perhaps was selected by natural selection in a tool-using species, but which is apt to fall into the habit of saying, you look around you, you see all these marvelously complex things called organisms. There must have been a cosmic engineer who designed them to do all the wonderful things that they do. And indeed, one can even suggest that until the advent of Darwin's theory itself, it was quite reasonable to attribute design in the world to a designer because we had no alternative. Richard Dawkins once said that Darwin made it possible for the first time to be an intellectually coherent atheist. I would add that the advent of neuroscience eliminated the other great temptation, namely to explain the complexity of human perception and behavior in terms of an immaterial spirit. Now that we know something about the brain, it's kind of swept that rationale for animistic beliefs out of an intelligent person's belief system.
I'm not so much arguing in the belief in the existence of the designer as in the fact that the belief in the designer possibly has some sort of evolutionary value. And I was wondering whether one could identify some sort of PET scan experiments or something like that that could be tried out on people of strong belief to see whether there was some area in the brain that lit up or something like that.
Yes, indeed that has been done, and there's controversy over the interpretation, but that has been done.
Did Dan want to add something?
Yeah, actually, yeah. I think the question is good. It's time to look for naturalistic explanations for this amazingly robust and expensive phenomenon that we have, religious practice and religious belief. And I think the first thing you have to realize is that evolution isn't a one-trick pony. There are many, many possible ways in which the evolution of our species could have created features which then are exploited in various ways and elaborated in various ways that create the phenomena that we observe around you. I'll give you an example. This is not at all proven, but it's a hypothesis to test. It does look as if religion, as we know it today, organized religion, all organized religions have descended from earlier religions, folk religions, which pretty much all involved shamans, healers, magic men, witch doctors, who ministered to their little groups, their local groups. And it is distinctly possible, first of all, we know that people all over the world have pretty well found all the edible plants, all the domesticatable species, all the useful herbs and drugs that are in their area and have figured out how to exploit them. So it's also very likely that these healers, over time, found all the techniques for improving the health of, and particularly lowering the anxiety and improving the mental health of the people who sought them out. And what I suspect may be the case, and this is not just my hypothesis, others have worked on it, is that if that is true, and if there is a genetic disposition for being hypnotizable, being readily more likely to exhibit a placebo effect, then there could be, in fact, a very strong selection in our ancestors for the capacity to be moved by the sort of treatments that the shamans discovered. After all, they were the only HMOs of their time, and if they found some tricks that worked on some people, there could have been very strong selection. My model here is what's known about lactose tolerance. We know that human populations that raised dairy cattle, that were dairying people, that in those people, by and large, it's a more complicated story, but the simple version is that cultural phenomenon created a selection pressure for adult lactose tolerance. And where that cultural phenomenon wasn't present, we don't have adult lactose tolerance by and large, and this is genetic. All you have to suppose is that the culture of shamanic healing could have created a strong selection pressure for emotional responsiveness to the sorts of treatments that were available. That could explain, that's just one of dozens of possibilities that can be explored. As you can perhaps guess from my having a lot to say on this subject, I'm writing a book on this very topic now, and come back next year and you can read that book.
I agree with the argument that creationism should not supplant science. And this is not my question, but I'll make it quick, but what bothers me sometimes is that the statements, the visions you have of religion a lot of times look back at an easy target. And in fact, to me, the greater issue is spirituality, and that is very alive and very well today. And there's a legitimate, and I consider myself an engineer as a scientist, and there's a legitimate discussion of what it's all about that we could have. It struck me, I heard Richard Dawkins a week ago, and it struck me to introduce himself by saying, or he was introduced, but I'm sure he wrote it himself, by pointing out he was an atheist. Now, I have nothing against atheism, but I just found it interesting that the scientist would normally go up and say, I'm a Jew or I'm a Catholic. He would go up and speak as a scientist. My question is actually to the gentleman who spoke about the universe, and that is, in fact, Francis Drake said a while ago that it's quite likely there are millions of intelligence, or whatever, but he did the math of it, which in some ways I find the discussion of religion to be kind of a science applied to something that isn't scientism. And I found it interesting that he said it's quite possible that we're the only intelligent species around, which I, like you, started out with Francis Drake being my hero, and now I'm kind of wondering about the equation. But I will ask you, given that we are so short-lived, and possibly not just that we have been here so little, but that we may expire long before the universe goes away, and that you think about these things, how do you relate to things like the argument about gay marriage, or things that happen now that may seem, even within our span of time on planets, so inconsequential and yet seem to be so important in what we're doing with each other?
So when I hear people arguing bitterly about gay marriage, or arguing bitterly about whether you're supposed to pray on Fridays or Saturdays or Sundays or not at all, I personally have a very hard time to get particularly worked up about either of those two issues, because to me the really big issue is, here we are on this spinning ball discovering all these beautiful things out there, and we've just discovered a technology that can put an end to it all and destroy ourselves. It happened in the last 100 years, right? And within the lifetime, especially of the younger part of the audience here, it is quite possible that we might just wipe ourselves out. On the other hand, it's also quite possible that we'll somehow get an act together, and maybe even the life we know is just the tip of an iceberg of much more profound sorts of life we haven't even dreamt of. So to me, the much more exciting question is, what's the future of life in the universe? And I really think that this place and this time, even though it's very small and very short, our lifetime, may be the most important place and the most important epoch in the history of everything we see out here, because it's within the power of you guys to go think about this, go out and do something about it, to try to influence that, and don't get too distracted by whether two lesbians who like each other can live together or not, because there are more important things to worry about. That's my message.
I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank all of our speakers here tonight. People will be signing up here, all of our speakers. There's copies for sale in the lobby, and thank you all for coming, and I hope you have something to think about. That's where you can use your chair. I'm Amanda from the bookstore. Thank you for coming tonight.
The Best American Science and Nature Writing 2004 is published by Houghton Mifflin. For more information, visit hmco.com.